invite you to take in the vibe here at Co-Culture. Please look around and note the artifacts that we have on display. These were made and used by real people, many of whom gave their lives in the struggle for freedom, dignity, and equality. From the white helmet and the Freedom Charter at the front of the exhibit to the drawings made by school children at the Al-Salam School in Idlib, these artifacts are a small representative of a struggle that has lasted more than 10 years, that was more than 40 years in the making, and that has been so tremendously costly and painful for Syrians. Aside from painful memories, I hope our Syria exhibit also inspires everyone to continue the good fight. Our revolution was certainly inspired by other movements, including the Arab Spring, but continues to inspire others. From Syria to Hong Kong, to Me Too, to Black Lives Matter, to environmental causes. Our struggle is shared across humanity. We share common humanity. At the end of the day, we pretty much all want the same things. So today, we're inviting you to care about nonviolent activism. We're inviting you to help us support nonviolent activism and see how we can effect global change. I'm honored to be here with my friends and colleagues Michael Beer and Kristyan Benedict. We'll have a conversation about inspired activism and its global impact, and I encourage everyone to think of tough questions for our experts. We'll have hopefully a lot of audience participation. Michael is the Executive Director of Nonviolence International. He's also the author of Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century. This is an update to Gene Sharp's so critical work. Michael has worked with Syrian activists as well as movements in Myanmar, Tibet, Palestine, Kosovo, Sudan, and others. Notably, Michael has led several trainings with Syrian activists, particularly in the early days of the revolution, and I remember those trainings very, very well. Kristyan joins us from Amnesty International UK's Crisis Response and Tactical Campaigns Program. I like to call Kristyan an honorary Syrian because of his extensive work with our activists. He has also supported and trained activists and human rights defenders from China, Hong Kong, Myanmar, Sudan, and others. Gentlemen, I'm honored to have you with us. Let's get started with a few questions, and we'll look to the audience to participate as well. We all know that activism isn't only about going after dictators. Activism can be in many forms, whether it's environmental or for other causes that move us. But since we're talking about Syria, and we're talking about an authoritarian regime, for both of you, with your experience, could you point to 3 things you've seen in common in Hong Kong, Myanmar, and Sudan? What 3 things do we have in common with Syria? And Kristyan, why don't we start with you, please?
Thanks, Rafif, and thanks for inviting me. And I mean, it's my honor actually to be here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but to be in the same program with you and Michael and others like Reem and Jumana, Assad, Yassine, it's a big honor, and just sorry I can't be there. It's a big question. What did those issues have in common? I mean, you know, across those different contexts, people are facing varying degrees of poverty, of corruption, of repression, of impunity. They're faced with local, regional, and international spoilers trying to maintain that poverty, that corruption, that repression, and that impunity. And all of them have remarkably brave, resilient, innovative activists and groups who, against the odds, against massive odds, let's be honest, are still challenging, with varying degrees of success, they're still challenging that structural inequality and discrimination, that repression and that impunity. And that's inspiring in itself, given the odds that activists are facing around the world.
Thank you. Michael, anything to add to that?
I would say that all of these conflicts you've mentioned have been examples of mass collective participation and action. And we know from research done by Maria Stefan and Erica Chenoweth that if you can maximize participation in a struggle, your chances of victory are much greater. And they point to the 3.5% threshold as an indicator that usually you will win if you can get that kind of participation, sustained participation from your citizens. And these struggles managed to get to this level of mass participation. And in the modern sense, this means not just including young men who often use violence, but includes women, the old, and the very young. So they all have this in common. I would also say they've also understood the modern media landscape, which is that not all modern media is the mainstream media, but that everybody is media. And so we have examples here in this exhibit of the spy camera. It's very interesting, where people are becoming citizen journalists and putting it out over their own social media or websites. People are becoming their own media and not relying on the mainstream media to get out their word. And then, at least in 3 or 4 of these, I would also say there's been a major role for people in the health field. You can look at conflict sometimes through a public health lens. We talked about the authoritarianism, the repression, the poverty, the corruption. You can look at that as a kind of a public health problem. And the medical workers in 3 of these conflicts have been major leaders in society in opposing and trying to address the terrible governance that's going on. And we have the white helmet here from a Syrian activist who was trying to help and resist the Assad regime. So these are some commonalities among these conflicts.
I would say in the case of Syria, the medical community and first responder communities were very specific targets of the regime. So this has been a very important point for us over the past 10 years. But going back to inspiration, right, and inspiring activist movements, Syria, I think, certainly was inspired by other movements, as we've mentioned already. And I think we've served as an inspiration to other countries, whether these were good or bad based on our own experiences with a brutal and ruthless regime that has almost successfully decriminalized the use of chemical weapons, or has normalized starvation sieges, or has made it acceptable to target the medical community. What are some lessons other movements can draw from the Syrian experience? Kristyan, I know you've done some extensive work in Hong Kong, for example. Could you give us a couple of lessons that may have been learned?
Yeah, I mean, you know, two similar but also very different situations in terms of the wider dynamics and the support systems that both activist movements have, but also the corrupt elites have as well. Certainly, you know, if I think back to early 2011, I was working with a lot of Chinese activists, and they were really moved and inspired by what was happening in Syria, and including to the point where one of the organizers of Tiananmen in 1989, one of the key organizers, Xiao Zhang, asked to speak at a rally I was organizing outside the Syrian embassy when it was still open. in London. And he spoke and he talked about how this was inspiring and will inspire a future generation, and stressed the importance of organization, coherence, and non-violence. That's something that you've seen in Hong Kong, you know, incredibly well organized and sophisticated movements, not just along media tracks, but also around advocacy and community organizing, around education. And also, I guess, the one thing to say on that is, whilst they've stressed all of these things and have been successful at organizing a mass movement, and think about Hong Kong, it's what, 7.5 million people. At its high point in June 2019, you had about 1.8 million people on the streets, and that's on the street. So, you know, you had a significantly more larger number of people not on the streets for whatever reason, who were also supportive. But I have to say, even though they've followed all those key principles and kept things 99% non-violent, and learnt from Syria in terms of not descending too quickly into chaos and disorganization and armed violence, the Chinese authorities have still managed to decimate that non-violent movement. Human rights are on the rollback in Hong Kong. And one thing that is, I think, instructive from conversations with Hong Kong activists is, and from learning from, I guess, the Syria context, is maybe this isn't the right time and we just need to get out. And essentially that's what happened for a lot of Hong Kong activists. They managed to secure exits, for instance, to the UK. You know, lots of Hong Kong activists have managed to get to the UK because the odds were just stacked against them, and really prominent activists were being picked off and sent to prison. And evidence against these activists were they were organizing non-violent protests. Not you know, they were trying to bring arms or whatever. It was that they were organizing non-violent protests. So there are inspirations, there are things you can learn, but you know, we're in a bad situation globally in terms of the forces of impunity having quite a lot of strength globally at the moment.
Absolutely, Kristyan, thank you for that. Michael, did you want to relate any lessons learned, or should we jump into nonviolent tactics?
I would briefly say that Hong Kong and Syria have suffered defeats, and yet the struggle moves on. And in both cases, there is a large diaspora community, particularly for the Syrians. 7 million in diaspora. This is a mighty force. And we live in a world that is interconnected. And so if you want to think like a military strategist, the idea is to expand the battlefield beyond the Syria proper. The whole world is a battlefield, and the Syrian diaspora with 7 million people in an interconnected world, if organized well, can have a very powerful impact going forward on Syria, and hopefully for the better.
Any comments or questions so far from anyone? So, I know based on your experience in Myanmar, for example, are you seeing that they're taking lessons from your book or maybe from Syria? I know we did some work with some activists. Do you want to expand on that?
There's no question that my book and the many books about nonviolent resistance that have been produced and films in the last generation or two are creating lots of cross-fertilization, and movements are learning from each other. It's always very difficult to pinpoint exactly where these particular ideas come from. The Myanmar activists have their own long resistance history that they also draw upon. I would say that clearly the power of narrative is very important in the current age of the internet. And each of these struggles involves a struggle around whose narrative is going to win. And usually if you can get your narrative to win, you usually will see success implemented in the power structures. And so this exhibit here is a small part of what Syrians are doing to tell their story, particularly tell the early story of the nonviolent resistance which so inspired the people of the country and so inspired the world before it devolved into war and outside intervention. So the people of Myanmar are telling their story, and they have to be able to tell their story now to different audiences. The Myanmar have to try to tell the story to the people of China, their neighbor. They have to tell the story to the people of India, their other big neighbor. They have to tell their story to the wider world. They need to be able to speak in different languages and provide these narratives to break through to the mainstream medias in these different countries. So, the power of narrative is what I hope people will remind themselves of as they go through and look at this exhibit here today and how important it is to tell your story.
And just to jump on that a little bit, this is something the three of us have in common, actually. Activists from Myanmar reached out to us wanting to use the Syrian Freedom Charter as part of their inspiration to write their own. Ours, of course, was inspired by the South African Freedom Charter, so I think it just shows the power of continuity and the power of using common nonviolent tactics and learning more about how we can connect as movements. So Michael, you were able to connect me with the Myanmar activists, and of course Christian, Amnesty International presented the Freedom Charter in London and really gave us a beautiful space in which to tell the story of 90,000 Syrians who had endorsed the Charter, and we're still counting. So it's great to have that, I guess, commonality, right? So thank you for that. Michael, you brought up mainstream media and how all of us now are journalists and we are all media. And Kristyan, I want you to talk a little bit about this, because you and all of us, most Syrians, know that the nonviolent movement still exists in Syria. We just don't see it in mainstream media. Maybe it's not sexy enough. Maybe it doesn't sell newspapers. How can we change the narrative so that we can show the world, beyond the Museum of Activism, how do we show that that passion for nonviolence still exists? How can we overcome the more militarized narrative?
I just wanted to actually quickly say something on Myanmar, just very, very quickly, on inspirations as well. Myanmar or Free Burma campaigners, they were also inspired by Syria. I remember some of the demonstrations I was organizing in the UK in 2011, 2012 on Syria, and Burmese activists would turn up and really striking, well choreographed flag waving ceremonies that they would be doing. And another thing as well, a bit more technocratic, is one of the most innovative things that happened on Syria, because of non-violence activists and human rights lawyers, was the establishment of the IIIM, the investigatory mechanism that was established in 2016 when the Security Council was deadlocked. And the same thing happened with Myanmar, with the Security Council deadlocked because of China and Russia again. Another similar large UN-mandated investigatory mechanism was established for Myanmar. So I think, there's some interesting crossovers there as well, but maybe we'll come back to that. In terms of the media side of things, yes, absolutely. I mean, Syrian non-violence activism and campaigning carries on. It's obviously important to recognize that activism isn't just, holding a banner, waving a placard, going to a protest. It's the whole, as obviously Michael can say more expertly than me, it's the dozens and dozens of different tactics that can be used. right through from, your ordinary stunt and protest, right through to really complex strategic litigation processes. And Berlin here is a real hub of strategic litigation, led by some great Syrian activists and lawyers, people like Anwar Bunny and Jumana as well, and many others. In terms of the mass media, though, and in terms of citizen journalism getting onto the mass media, and what's going to capture people's imagination and create news stories, now's a difficult time because of COVID. I would say that a lot more people are more insular and atomized, and understandably thinking about themselves and their immediate family. That's just the reality. And international events are very distant, and it's become easier to not run large packages and invest in international media. I mean, Afghanistan a few weeks ago was a bit of an aberration in that sense, but that's died down again, even though it's still horrendous what's happening there. But I think with regards to getting on the media, there are obviously some fundamentals in terms of having a coherent, as much as possible, unified movement with a very clear vision and a smart strategy to achieve that vision. Having people who are credible to talk about and amplify that vision. Syria sometimes suffered from that because who was speaking the loudest, if you like. But those principles still remain. Those people who have that long-term vision and can present a credible theory and strategy of how change will happen in this particular context, recognizing all the limitations that a non-violence movement will have in an environment like Syria, which doesn't exactly have the conditions to nurture a successful non-violence movement yet. I would say yet. These things take generations in places like Syria, and that's what for me is still inspiring about those activists, and there's many of them in Berlin who are still pursuing that long-term change goal, and are keeping their hands clean from some of the regional spoilers that, in my view, and probably other people's view, intentionally decimated Syria's non-violence movement in early to mid 2011.
And just to follow up on that, talking about credibility, I know from my time with the local coordination committees in Syria how difficult it was for us to establish credibility. And I think Yassine and Reed, yesterday you spoke about the Violations Documentation Center, and for our activists to document deaths and verify the names and addresses and ages and where they were from and their background and how they were killed. This was almost superhuman at a time when the regime was targeting people simply for distributing humanitarian relief. So imagine if you were a documenter, if you were an activist trying to validate news, or if you were trying to disseminate it. So the challenge continues, but we still need to do more to get back into the rhythm of being credible and showing our news and letting the world not forget, reminding the world about the atrocities that are being committed. Now I know, Michael, you and I had kind of a debate this morning about the citizen journalist and being on social media and attracting the attention of mainstream media. Did you want to go into that a little bit?
Well, we're all media, we're actors. We don't just have to petition the power holders, the mainstream media, or the politicians for power. We have agency. It may not be a lot, but collectively it's a lot. So let's think in terms of using our own media capabilities, as was done in Syria with some of the items here, and the mainstream media picked up on these local sources that really had the feet on the ground and provided that really good material. So ultimately, the media is going to be focused on transgression, wherever you can see transgression. And you can have nonviolent transgression, you can also have violent transgression. And the media is generally focused on power, at least traditionally how they understand power. And if you can show that you're manifesting power and tell that story and convince the media that you are powerful and that you're leveraging change, then the chances are that you can get some attention.
Please, go ahead. Sorry, please just give your name.
Okay, I'm Inga. I'm German. I'm an activist as well. We have an amnesty group. We're working on Syria. And I think that activists, especially in diaspora, they need allies. And you said like 7 million Syrians are a huge power, but like I think we cannot ask each of the 7 million persons to be an activist, and we have to completely understand everyone who just wants to like have a calm life here in Germany. So it's crucial that like in our case German people also take a stance, but also it's crucial but it's challenging also, because like how do we work, like how do we want to support them but not speak for like them? So this is something that maybe we can discuss this further.
Well, I think it's a really interesting point. So of course, for people who have fled the destruction and the devastation of their country, maybe the last thing they want to do is continue to participate in an uprising. But on the other hand, I think at the Museum of Activism, what we're saying is, and I think Kristyan and Michael have echoed this, you don't need to hold up a banner, and you don't need to go marching down the street. Right? I think all of us are on social media, right? Are you on Facebook? Yes. Are you on Twitter? Are you on Instagram? So I think we have opportunities to state our opinions. And when you're Syrian, the act of stating your opinion is an act of activism. This is a powerful movement to say no, and to give yourself the right to say no. And now that we are 7 million strong abroad, we have that power. We've been empowered simply by not being in Syria. So everybody's in no. But yes, Kristyan, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I mean, one really tangible example I will give. For me, at the vanguard of those Syrians that are still pursuing a better Syria and are doing it in a smart way are Syrian investigators, lawyers, human rights defenders, working on collecting evidence to file national authorities to pursue strategic litigation initiatives. In Germany, you've got the Syrian Center for Legal Studies headed by Anwar Bunni. You've got organizations like Mazen Darwish's organization based in Paris, Syrian Center for Media. I've had conversations with both of them. We've developed, worked with them on a whole range of training programs and developed fundraising and financial management strategy, security plans. And, in terms of, I've asked that question of them before, in terms of how is it that the Syrian diaspora are not investing heavily in your organizations? How is it that, you're having to always struggle to find finances from large institutional donors, whether they be states or foundations or whatever, and that this great resource of the Syrian diaspora, even if it's just 10% of the diaspora, are not investing in you? And that's, I think, something that needs to be developed with those sorts of organizations, because it's not 2011, 2012, 2013 anymore, where there was a lot of money flooding into Syrian civil society from left, right, and center. Those days are gone, and the Syrian diaspora are going to be crucial to investing in individuals and Syrian individuals and organizations that have that long-term vision, that are credible, that have that smart, strategic, decades-long approach to how you bring about positive change in a country. And from their side, it's through it's through hunting down the people who are responsible for the most grave violations. But they need support from the Syrian diaspora, 100%.
Your question about allyship is so important. And Amnesty International has been a leader in this regard, an international network of people around the world trying to provide some allyship, some co-resistance to and support for people around the world. My organization, Nonviolence International, is trying to do the same thing, so please join us and help us build a global network where we can support nonviolent activism across borders and to help the Syrian diaspora and to help all these other folks around the world that can use support. I'd just like to highlight the word co-resistance. It's important to do allyship, as you've indicated, in ways that centers the voices and the narratives of the people's concerns, so that their voices are central, and that we as co-resistors, many of us coming from places of privilege, can center them and support their voices to be heard. And whether it's working on Syria or Burma or a nation state, or whether as a man supporting women to get rid of male supremacy, we have lots of co-resistance work that can be done across borders and in your own communities that can make a difference.
Thank you both for that. Any other audience questions? Please, Yassin.
I would like to comment on what Mike mentioned a few minutes ago about the power of narrative. What has struck me so many times is that almost everybody in the world has their own narrative. It happens to be that I'm Syrian and someone from Germany or from Turkey, I've been there for almost 4 years. They want to explain what was happening in Syria to me. And they were usually heated debates that it is just conspiracy or regime change or whatever. So it is not the case about that process. When things are clear about Turkey, it is a government. So it is always clear. It is not the case about Palestine. It is not. Mostly it is not the case about Iraq, about CCG. What are your ideas about this current situation? I mean, why our narrative is facing all these obstacles? And how to win the battle of narrative, in your opinion?
So basically, why is our narrative facing obstacles, and how do we counter the counter-narrative?
And why there are so many narratives?
Why are there so many? And I think
almost
this actually,
everybody has his own narrative policy.
yes, and I think this also ties into the comment and the question from the colleague at Amnesty as well. So Kristyan, do you want to give that a shot?
I think the Syrian narrative of, you know, you're talking about multiple narratives going on with Syria, and sometimes I can be talking to a Syrian human rights activist who has got several contradictory narratives going at the same time, which is always fun and fascinating. But, you know, with regards to Syria and the narrative of highlighting that there is this horrendous fascist dictatorship supported by authoritarian regimes and a wide movement from the far left through to the extreme far right, that narrative is actually quite well established and amplified compared to people's understanding of what was happening in Syria before 2011. It was pretty low, I got to say. There wasn't that much knowledge. Maybe with regards to the Israel-Palestine context, there was in terms of non-Syrians. But after that, it's actually cut through a lot. And in terms of the developments and the initiatives, compared to other activist movements, you know, other individuals and activists who are, I don't know, you know, maybe from Central African Republic or from Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Colombia, actually haven't had as much cut through as Syrian activists have. The initiatives, like I mentioned, like the IIIM, like a massive Security Council resolutions, like having Resolution 2165, where aid could go into the country without the consent of the state. These were innovative, big developments, and they haven't stopped. So, you know, I think, you know, if I try to put a Syria hat on with my honorary Syrian hat on, it's immensely frustrating, because what's been the outcome? Well, on the surface, you know, massive death and destruction, displacement, lots of people disappeared, still in Assad's dungeons, and the regime is still there. And we're at a situation politically where steps towards some form of diplomatic reopening and normalization is happening again. We won't have time to go into that and what the dynamics and the more private dynamics are going on with that step-for-step approach. But you know, Syria has been quite dominant in terms of human rights, the UN, political narratives, how much money has been invested by various governments. And there's a lot to build on, actually. There's some actually big, solid foundations, because the understanding that this regime is what it is, and I think it's fairly well accepted. I think it's notable that a lot of so-called progressive activists and outlets have taken the side of the regime, you know, and they've used their credibility, if you like, that they've built upon, say, Palestine campaigns to denigrate Syria's non-violence movement. I mean, that has undoubtedly been harmful, but I think the tide is turning on that as well. Actually, I'm a bit more positive, and maybe as an outsider, I have that more distant view of the landscape. If you were inside it and you had, you know, and tragically, obviously, and sadly, as Yassine and many other people here know, you know, if you're really close to it, it's going to be all enveloping. And I understand that, but from someone who's outside it, I actually see a lot still that is positive to build on, whether at the local level with local activists, especially the next younger generation of Syrian activists, right through to some of the UN structures that have been developed and built. I could be wrong. Everything, you know, it could go like Afghanistan. I could be wrong. But at the moment, I see quite a lot of positives that are there to be built on.
I think you've uplifted us a little bit. Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, we need to wrap up fairly soon. I would say it requires a long answer. Winning the narrative is not enough. Nonviolent action consists of three major parts I've outlined in my book: what you say, the narrative, what you do, and what you don't do. And we need action and not doing meaning strikes and boycotts, in order to manifest power and to make the change. I look forward to discussing this afterwards in greater depth.
Right, absolutely. Just jumping on the changing narrative and the action and inaction. One thing I think we all know is that you can watch with interest, you can sort of watch with apathy, or you can take action. You can take decisive action. It starts with us as individuals, and we can build from there. And I'll give you an example. Kristyan Benedict has written and produced a book about her ancestral Aleppo. And she's traced her family origins and talked about, it's in the title, deconstruction and reconstruction. So this type of initiative is fabulous to start telling our stories, right? And repeating our stories. If you'd like to take action today, you don't have to go start a demonstration, but you can write an inspirational message on our little tree and help us create yet another museum artifact. You can follow the Museum of Activism on social media. You can help us make some noise, right? If there's a different movement you'd like to highlight, please let us know, because while we are focused on Syria right now, we actually would like to exhibit other movements because we see that common humanity where activists step out of their comfort zone and make some noise about issues that, quite frankly, just piss them off. And sometimes we just have to be pissed off and to go take action. If there are no more questions, I'm going to thank our friends Michael and Kristyan for your insights and your contributions. I thank our museum visitors for attending and for your questions. I'd like to give a special thanks to Baytna, our sponsor, for making this Museum of Activism launch possible. Esad, I see you hiding here. Thank you very, very much. And I'd like to thank the entire Museum of Activism team, the entire team, and our wonderful volunteers, because your tireless dedication has allowed us to go from vision to reality, and we can only do better going forward. And so now let's also thank Jasmine Catering by enjoying their delicious food, which will be served very soon. I'd say, if no more questions, let's eat.